I tend to suspect that these elections are going to make this crisis worse and not better. If you have a Democratic House and the Democratic House wants to call in members of the administration and ask them questions, will the administration show up? If they have contempt proceedings, if they pass a appropriations bill out of the House that the White House doesn't like, is the White House simply going to follow congressional dictates, or are they going to start doing what they've been doing all along under OMB and making it up and refusing to do what Congress has directed? And I suspect that this will heighten the tension and not lessen the tension, because the White House will now have a branch of the Congress that is pushing at it. And they've already demonstrated with the supine Congress that we had that they're going to walk all over them. If they get resistance, this is not an administration that backs down. They're going to double and redouble the tension.
Welcome to Management Matters. I'm James-Christian Blockwood. For this week's episode, we're taking a look at the challenges of modernizing government and what may be next for Congress and the federal government going forward. I'm joined by Daniel Schuman, the Executive Director of the American Governance Institute, a nonpartisan nonprofit working to strengthen the institutions of American democracy. He is also the founder and editor of the First Branch Forecast, a weekly newsletter that highlights congressional activity in great detail. Daniel, thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to join. First-time joiner, long-time listener.
I always like to start with a broad view. You'd know this because you listen and follow us. And I'm going to challenge you this week. Tell us about why you think we're at such a crossroads for American institutions and how a new look toward modernizing government may show us a brighter way forward.
There's a lot to unpack there, but I'll just start unwrapping here and we can keep unwrapping as we go on. The combination of the executive branch and the courts have changed the landscape for the political and agency framework that Congress had set up over the last 100 years. So that the question of independence of agencies, the role of the Supreme Court in overturning longstanding precedent, the changing way that members of Congress think about themselves, and the work that they do in the relationship with the executive branch has brought us, I think, to a crisis point. Every 30 to 50 years, there's an opportunity for Congress to rethink the way that it operates, where the way it's been doing things no longer works. And I think looking around with the increase in discharge petitions, with the removal of a speaker, with the agitation that we're seeing in the elections. And as a nonprofit, I stay as far away from the elections as I humanly can. But seeing all that tumult that's happening and the agitation that there must be a different way to do things, I think that is all indicative that we are coming to a moment where there are a number of different paths and a combination of the incentives for the politicians, the incentives for the American people, and the way the courts and the executive branch sort of play out will change the path in a very significant way in the near term.
You use the word crisis, but I would imagine American institutions are built for resiliency. At least our larger government certainly has been. How are you defending the word crisis? Give me a little more detail about what you're seeing and what the consequences might be.
The different branches are getting out of their lanes. So the executive branch is aggregating to itself the ability to make decisions around federal spending. We're seeing this with impoundment, which is unlawful. We're seeing it with efforts to engage in rescissions that haven't been approved by Congress. We're seeing efforts to move around the appropriations process that has been durable for decades and decades and decades and moving some of those powers elsewhere. We're seeing the calling out of troops onto the street, the maintenance of American forces overseas, despite a war powers resolution having passed both chambers, calling for the termination of the conflict. We're seeing the Office of Legal Counsel putting out opinion after opinion, expanding the presidency's powers. We're seeing the federal courts changing what constitutes an independent agency, where the president is asserting the ability to fire pretty much anybody inside the executive branch, and also efforts to reach inside the legislative branch with the efforts to remove the Librarian of Congress, which was successful, efforts to knock on the door of the Government Accountability Office and elsewhere. So there are a whole bunch of these points that are at great tension. And we're seeing, along with that, a heightening of the rhetoric in terms of the legitimacy of other parties, of other people, of the way that we do things. And we're seeing greater calling to question of the election process, which, you know, the alternation of power was the first great gift that George Washington gave us, besides, of course, winning the Revolutionary War, which was a minor footnote. So all of these things are coming together. So this looks to me like a crisis. When you look at American history over the last 250 years, it looks like some of the major crises that we've seen at the end of the Lochner era and leading into the New Deal. We saw this in the 19th century as well, with the questions over whether the states would be preeminent. When we change the language from the United States are to the United States is, this is that type of moment. At least that's what it seems like to me.
Another gift that George Washington gave us was stepping down from the power to which he held, thus giving us a constitutional republic and not a king and a monarchy to follow. You highlighted many important points. I have to ask, where is the accountability and where are the checks and balances of what you mentioned? You highlighted that we're in a moment where you and many others could argue we're seeing expanding presidential power. We're potentially seeing Congress that is gaining more and more of a reputation of being absent or at least not fully exercising its authorities in a manner to which we would hope that it would. What needs to happen to reshift this balance of power to have accountability for things that are either overreach or even beyond overreach and may be seen as illegal? What needs to happen for this pendulum to start swinging the other way?
There are two ways, I think, to answer. One is the things that need to happen, right? The outcome. So Congress needs to reassert its power of the purse. It passes appropriations bills and the president needs to sign it. If the president doesn't sign it, then they need to override a veto. They need to reassert control. They need to address some of the structural problems that arose where some of Congress's powers have been denuded by the courts. But that is one level of the answer. The other, I think, level of the answer is that people need to conceive of their roles differently. Members of Congress often view themselves as being directed by the president of their party or opposing the president of the other party. It wasn't always that way, but lawmaking should not come from the presidency. That is not the presidential role. But the unwillingness of co-partisans to stand up, their incentives to fall in line, the aggregation of power at the top of the House in particular means that most of the members there don't have anything to do. They don't have the ability to exercise power, and their ability to fundraise is driven in part by the ability to be outrageous and to draw attention. If you can change their incentives, then their behavior will follow, and that behavior then makes it possible to do things like have enough staff and pay them well, to assert Congress's prerogatives on war powers, on tariffs, on appropriations, on institutional design, to push back on the president's nominees to the courts. And that, folks, not that necessarily disagree with the president, but reflect a congressional perspective and not just an executive branch supremacist perspective, which is what we've been getting from judicial nominees from both parties for quite a while. I think that incentives layer drives the policy outcomes that we need to see. And as long as the incentives are misaligned, as long as they're set up for either you're going to salute or wave your fist at the president, then the result is going to be escalating conflict, which is what we have.
Let me follow up with three questions here. The first being, a president shouldn't legislate necessarily, but if you see an absent legislative branch, do you think the president's role then is to, by executive order or other means, seek out ways to achieve the policy agenda? The second question is, you talk about what needs to happen within different branches, particularly the legislative branch. We have elections coming up. Is there a chance there to reset who we send to Congress and what they think about their responsibilities once they get there? And then the third is, you mentioned confirmation. That's a lengthy process. And I think we have a math problem in that the number of Senate confirmed positions and the time it takes to get there, it's just almost impractical to think that a president could put those number of candidates in place. How do you think about revising the advice and consent role of Congress or the Senate, and what needs to change in our appointments process?
Those are three great questions. So let's start with the power vacuum. If Congress fails to legislate, it is not the job of the executive branch to stand in its place, particularly where the reason why Congress is failing to do some of the things that it needs to do is because of the encroachment of the executive branch, where you're seeing sort of the back end of the cycle. The cycle is presidential overreach. Then members of Congress don't want to do things because they're co-partisan in the White House, or because they think it can get solved elsewhere because it's politically difficult. And that then drives presidential overreach to do more, assuming that you have a president who's actually trying to do the right thing, right? There are not always presidents who are trying to do the right thing. Sometimes you have presidents who are trying to do the wrong thing. But a system where a unitary entity makes policy-making decisions for everyone is not a democracy. It's a different form of government. That is not the form of government that we have. It's not the form of government that we've had for 250 years. While we have seen decisions, like, for example, in the New Deal era, to empower the presidency to do more, in my research, I was looking at adoption of House rules because I'm a crazy person and I was interested in that. There was a moment where all the banks were failing over the weekend, and the House of Representatives just gets sworn in, and the president wants to have a banking holiday. Such a anodyne term for shutting down the banks, right? The House of Representatives, before adopting its rules, which is the second thing it does when it meets, we're not even going to adopt our rules. We are going to move immediately to vote to consider the president's legislation, the president's proposal as advanced by his party in the House, to allow a banking holiday to happen. And every single member of the House voted to let it happen, where the Republicans said, we're not sure this is the right thing, but this is, I think, the best that we can do in these circumstances, and we're going to let the president make this decision. But also the House voted. The policymakers decided. No committee chairs, no leadership, blank slate, but Congress legislated in that crisis. That's what you need. Congress needs to be the deciders for lawmaking purposes. It cannot be the president, because then it's no longer a president, it's something else. So the second question has to do with elections. And whether, I think part of it was like, what will it change things? My crystal ball is cloudy. I have no idea. But I tend to suspect that these elections are going to make this crisis worse and not better. Again, I can't predict the future, but let's say that Democrats retake the House and Republicans maintain control in the Senate, or maybe it's closer. I don't know. The Senate doesn't really matter in this scenario. If you have a Democratic House, and the Democratic House wants to call in members of the administration and ask them questions, will the administration show up? If they have contempt proceedings, if they pass a appropriations bill out of the House that the White House doesn't like, is the White House simply going to follow congressional dictates, or are they going to start doing what they've been doing all along under OMB and making it up and refusing to do what Congress has directed? And I suspect that it will be the latter, that this will heighten the tension and not lessen the tension, because the White House will now have a branch of the Congress that is pushing at it. And they've already demonstrated with the supine Congress that we had that they're going to walk all over them. If they get resistance, I assume that they're just going to, this is not an administration that backs down. They're going to double and redouble the tension. The third question that you asked is about confirmation. And I think we can divide this. There's confirmation for federal judges. There's confirmation for, say, I don't know, the head of the Department of Defense or Department of War for people who are aficionados of that title, versus the undersecretary for things that I can't remember, right? There's all of those folks that need to go through, and there's the military commissions, all that stuff. There has been a lot of discussion recently, and I think the Partnership for Public Service have been pushing some of this to reduce the number of folks that need to be Senate confirmed. I am not sure that in a circumstance where the courts are saying that the president can hire and remove whoever he wants, whenever he wants, for basically whatever reason that he asserts, whether valid or otherwise, that the Senate should be in the business of relaxing its hold on one of the few mechanisms to act as a gatekeeper for who serves.
That's a very interesting perspective. I recently wrote a piece that talked about Trump v. Slaughter and the impact that I think it would have. I made the judgment that what we really should be focused on is individual leadership, and who you put in place to lead institutions really matters. And so the Senate has an important role to ensure that we put the right people in place, just as the president does in selecting who he or she may want to appoint. And most importantly is the person who assumes those duties is the right person who leads ethically, who understands good management principles and practices, and certainly that their role should be to advance the lives, the welfare of the American people through whichever institution they're leading. So I'm a public servant at heart. You know that. I believe in principled leadership. I believe in free and fair elections, rule of law, and importantly, that any duly elected president should be able to set their policy agenda and have a workforce working in earnest to help them achieve it. A lot has to happen for that to go well. You talk about at AGI this concept around durable democracy. We've existed for 250 years now. And in this moment, what can we really do to enhance government's durability? Do you see this as reform around the edges, or do you think this is a fundamental transformational shift that has to happen? You've been writing about this, you've been championing reform on the Hill and elsewhere for quite some time. What is it going to take to keep this durable democracy?
It's a really big question and a really hard one. I do think that this is a turning point, a transformational moment. One we touched on a little bit earlier, which is the incentives for the political actors. I think that the way the House and the Senate have structured themselves no longer works. I think that we need more fluid factions in the chambers where you can tell if someone's running for office, are they progressive or are they a New Dem or are they a Blue Dog? Are they Republican Study Committee? Are they the ever vanishing Liz Cheney Republican or are they a MAGA Republican? You need to have better understanding of who these folks are, and they need to be able to combine with each other in different ways. So if there's agreement on tariffs that's across the party lines, then so be it. The current role of party leaders is to keep your team together and to break apart the other side. And that means that 70% of issues or 80% of issues that we need to resolve will never come up because it's going to split your team. And what we need are institutions that are capable of having durable majorities that enact and implement policies over longer periods of time. We also have this wish fulfillment concept of the presidency. The president's going to come and he's going to, maybe he's going to come in and fix everything. And then all the policies are going to change because it's a new president. No, Congress makes the policies. They draw the lines on the picture and the president has to color inside it. The president doesn't get to take a giant Sharpie and just scribble all over. That's not how it works, or at least that shouldn't be how it works. So we are looking for sort of a wish fulfillment that, Congress is hopelessly gridlocked, so the president can come in and he's going to solve X. And no, that may have been true for a period of time, but that gets us into trouble. The place to have political fighting is in Congress. That is where we come together and have our both ideological and practical disagreements, and we work out solutions that we can live with. It isn't some guy coming in and all or nothing and solving the thing. That is the road to the end of democracy and gets you someplace else. And finally, the courts. Our good friends, the courts. They're supposed to be modest. They're supposed to be deferential to the legislative branch and to the executive branch. But what you have is a bunch of former solicitors general and OLC attorneys who are co-partisans with the White House that are advocating for a muscular presidency at the expense of the rest of our political system. And as a result, you have had earthquakes, right? I mean, you said pre-tremors. Sorry, I'm not good with the earthquake analogy. I should have picked a different one, but like the foreshocks, right? Bush v. Gore is a foreshock 20 years ago. There's foreshocks with the overruling of Heller in the gun decisions. There are foreshocks that have slowly occurred and like it's grown greater as time has gone by. And now we have the president is immune from prosecution. Where did that come from? That's not rooted in anything. That's just made up, right? The president is immune. The president can fire anyone he wants inside the executive branch. No, he can't, right? That's not the way that we understand our law. You have Chevron and then you don't have Chevron. Well, Chevron deference in terms of how the courts interpret rulemakings. If you'd asked me 30 years ago or 40, like I wouldn't have been happy with the Chevron opinion, but overturning it in this way has the practical effect of undermining the legislative branch because it doesn't have the large majorities that it had before to create a lot of the mechanisms that lock policies in place. The courts say, well, Congress can just fix it, but it's really hard to fix when you have a 50-50 House and Senate and a president that is entrenched and can stop things from going forward. I think that there needs to be fundamental change at the court level as well. The final piece is the way we organize our elections. And I don't mean election administration. I mean, we have a disproportionately representative Senate, which is a consequence of my home state's Connecticut Compromise, but also the House, the way that we have single member districts. There's a really good book called Why Cities Lose that talks about our system and other systems that are descended from the British Parliament and why the single member district model doesn't work. There have been other models in the past, including in the US in the 19th century. There are other ways to do this. I don't think we can get there from here immediately, but we need to look at what happens when states draw lines that favor, not just favor majorities, but entrench one party in and lock out the other. Having these minoritarian systems, minoritarian in the Senate, minoritarian in the state legislatures that are blocking out whole swaths of voters, minoritarian in the courts. This is making me look at the 19th century and think about the slaveocracy system and how they used minority control to block out majority wishes. And I feel like that creates institutional gridlock and ultimately breakup. And that is not a direction that we want to go.
You mentioned this wish fulfillment expectation, but I believe that's because how we set up our government. And you highlighted a number of unprecedented decisions that have been made that mainly affect the executive branch and the president. But again, that's because we allow it. And I think we have this winner take all politics, and we need to change that. That is a perverse incentive for people to come and be able to work in a way that doesn't require them to work with other people. We need balance in our branches. So the White House and Congress and the courts need to understand their respective roles, but then have the right and proper check and balances in place. We need better leaders in place, those that understand their role and lead with the right principles first and with people in mind, especially those from the communities they come from and the people they serve. We need more incentive for collaboration. And that doesn't mean it's without contention. It just means you have real debate, real dialogue, get into real issues, find out what's best for our country, and then go forward with your best decisions in mind. So I have to ask, you mentioned that you're a crazy person. I have to strongly disagree with you. But even if you are, I think we need a little bit of that. I want to talk in very specific terms here. You've been thinking about how to modernize Congress and other institutions for quite some time. What do you think is the most important thing Congress could do to supercharge modernization of government today?
The problem is incentives. I think this is where a lot of it comes down to. And my answer to you is not going to be a satisfying answer. But the answer is to empower the factions inside the House and to weaken some of the veto points inside the Senate. The political factions have coherent ideologies. The progressives and the New Dems and the Blue Dogs and the RSC, like they all stand for things, but they're not able to be expressed. So we have to help them be able to express what they want to do and to build coalitions to do those things. When you have people that are empowered to do stuff, that are organized to do stuff, that have the capability of taking their ideas and putting it into legislation and moving it through the chamber and insisting on it and fighting for it, then they start looking towards, I want to do this thing, but I don't understand how this behavior works in the executive branch. And they're not giving me the answers I need, so I'm going to pass another data act, or I'm going to go and make sure that I can see how the appropriations are working, or that I can reach inside Treasury, that I have the staff that I need to understand what's going on, that I have the expertise, that I understand the mechanisms of power, that my staffers don't leave after 2 years, and that, by gosh, they're not 23 years old, they've been there for 30 years, that the Government Accountability Office can get the answers to the questions that it needs. And if it's not, we give it the authority and the capability to do the things that it needs to do that our friends at the Congressional Research Service have the expertise and not a 20% turnover rate inside the American Law Division, which they had a couple years back. Maybe a lot of the regulatory stuff shouldn't be inside OIRA, but it should be inside the legislative branch, that the inspectors general should be appointed through a different mechanism. When you are able to do stuff, you look for tools to do those things. And if you don't have the tools, you invent them. And if you do have them, you make them more capable. But that has to come from wanting and being able to do a thing. People are responsive to those incentives. You're in the House and you realize that you can't do much. These people aren't stupid. They're going to figure out ways that they can be effective. They're going to leave and they're going to run for governor or for mayor, or they're going to go host a talk show or wherever it is that they're going to go and be a lobbyist, right? But if you can be there and do stuff and find colleagues to do things with and principled adversaries that you can fight with and negotiate with and to make common cause with or common adversaries, that drives all the other stuff, including pushing back at the White House, including holding the courts to their proper role, including writing laws that meet the needs of the American people so that you can stay in office and keep doing those things. And I think that, for me, that's why I'm a rules guy. That's where you start.
You highlighted leadership, you highlighted values, you talked about why institutions matter, why following a process and following rules matter. I want to end on a positive note. You highlighted a lot of opportunity worthy of exploring for change and reform, and a number of things that the courts and Congress and the White House should all be thinking about in terms of how they work going forward. Give us one thing that the American public can be confident in and optimistic about in terms of what our government can accomplish if we get some of these things right.
I want to make 2 points, I think. One is that people look at Congress and they see the fighting as a bad sign. I think the fighting is good. We want them fighting at Congress. We want the stakes to matter. We want them to be doing things that matter. There's long been power held by subsets of the factions in both chambers. And having other folks emerge that want to change the way it works is the way that we have seen reform happen in our political system before. A bunch of people get locked out for a period of time, and then they figure out ways to come in and change the system. And when they do that, they accomplish great things. So you have 30 years of the Lochner era, the late 1890s, early 1920s. The political system doesn't take care of a whole bunch of basic questions around like a 40-hour work week and not letting kids work in the mines and having basic protections if you get old and sick and so that you don't die. And the apotheosis of the system not functioning and this lock into this economic model that was embraced by the courts was the New Deal that led to significant changes that was a vast improvement in the lives of the vast majority of Americans, where we have all of these protections that we didn't have before. There was a failed effort in the Civil War era with Reconstruction, where you had, for a period of time, the radical Republicans, like broad enfranchisement of a number of people that were locked out and significant changes in the political system. But ultimately, it didn't go far enough. People got tired of that effort and it got ground down. But we've seen this a couple of times in American history. The rising political engagement, the people that you see waving signs on the street when you drive by, the increasing turnout, that is a sign of political engagement, that people want something different. And you hear some of what they're talking about, and some of it sounds really good. Some of it is framed in the negative, right? Young people can't buy homes, and that there's all those sets of problems. But there's also discussion around what some of the answers to those things could be, and imagining a better future for all of us, where children and adults' healthcare is taken care of, where the economy works better, where people are wealthier, where we're able to deal with existential problems like the environmental crisis that's happening, where we can treat people more humanely, where you have a society where it's more possible for people to grasp the opportunities that are available to them and that there are more opportunities to do those things. Moments of crisis are challenging and disconcerting. But on the other side, if we do it right, if we play our cards right, if we think through the systems and the incentives for the players and what we want to get to, it is possible to attain those things. It's not just because I think that it's possible, but because we have seen throughout American history that it is possible to do those things if we work hard, if we find ways to collaborate and to compete in the right venues and to incentivize the fighting to happen in the right types of places.
Hard work, collaboration, and the right incentives, and I'll just add the right leadership, can certainly lead to the best outcomes. This has been a great conversation with a very knowledgeable person on history and an expert on government reform, particularly as it relates to the legislative branch, the executive director of the American Governance Institute, Daniel Schuman. Thank you so much for joining us.
James-Christian, it was such a pleasure. Thank you for having me on.
Management Matters is a presentation of the National Academy of Public Administration, produced and edited by Matt Hampton.